They say America was built on family, on bloodlines passed down with pride and tradition. But some bloodlines were poisoned from the start. Some families carried secrets so grotesque that even history tried to bury them, locking away the truth in whispers, sealed records, and half-burned diaries. Yet the earth never forgets. The soil remembers. And sometimes, if you dig deep enough, you uncover a horror so raw, so unrelenting, that it changes the way you look at the word family forever. This is not a story of survival. This is not a story of love. This is the story of a man who blurred the boundaries of blood until they no longer existed, who took his own daughter as wife and became the architect of a dynasty born of sickness, shame, and silence. His name has been half erased, but his shadow still lingers in the dark valleys of Appalachia, where family trees twist in ways that should never have been possible. Imagine growing up in a cabin so isolated that the world outside felt like another country. No schools, no church bells, no neighbors, just the unbroken silence of the woods and the rules of a patriarch who demanded absolute obedience. Children born into this silence did not know the difference between right and wrong. They only knew his word, his hand, his will, and it was through this control that he made himself both father and husband, both ancestor and lover. A role so grotesque that even the whispered rumors sent shivers through nearby towns. But this story isn't just about one man's corruption. It's about what happens when a community looks away, when poverty and isolation weave together into a noose, tightening around every generation. The children born from him bore the marks, strange features, slurred speech, unsteady bodies. They carried the curse of blood folded in on itself. Yet behind their deformities was a deeper wound, the kind that cannot be seen, the kind etched into the human soul when innocence is destroyed at its very root. We are not meant to look at stories like this. They disturb the very idea of family, of lineage, of what it means to belong. But buried in these forgotten places, families like his existed, their secrets rotting in silence. Tonight we open that silence. Tonight we walk into the dark history of America's most inbred patriarch. The earliest records of his family are scattered and incomplete, almost as if someone wanted them erased. Census takers would pass through the mountains, jotting down what they could, but the numbers never quite added up. A household that should have had 3 children somehow had 6. Names shifted, ages overlapped, and daughters disappeared from the page, only to reappear months later with infants in their arms. The community whispered, but no one asked questions directly. They knew better. In places like this, questions could cost you more than answers ever would. He was known as a hard man, a figure who stood taller than most, his voice carrying through the valley like a warning. Neighbors described him as proud, domineering, with eyes that could silence even grown men. But beneath that authority was something darker, an obsession with keeping his bloodline pure, untouched by outsiders. To him, family wasn't just important. Family was everything. And in that twisted devotion he made himself both protector and predator. His daughter, the one he would later claim as wife, never knew a world beyond his reach. From the time she could walk, her life was measured by his rules. The chores she did, the clothes she wore, even the way she spoke. Everything was molded by him. When she reached womanhood, there was no ceremony, no celebration. Only a quiet shift, a change in how he looked at her, and a chilling declaration that she now belonged to him in ways no daughter ever should. It is said that when their first child was born, the midwife refused to return. The baby's face bore features too familiar, too close to its mother's, and too hauntingly similar to its grandfather's. The whispers grew louder, but still, no one intervened. Neighbors turned their backs, convinced it was not their place to interfere in the affairs of a family so reclusive, so dangerous. Poverty gave them their excuse. Fear sealed their silence. Each child born into that cabin carried not just his blood, but the mark of his crime. And yet within those walls, it was treated as normal. Love was distorted, fatherhood was corrupted, and childhood was shattered before it even began. What was monstrous to the outside world was just daily life in his household. This was not a single act of violation. It was a system, a dynasty, built on a foundation of control so absolute that no one inside could see a way out. The tragedy of this family was not only written in their bodies, but in their silence. Those children born from blood folded back on itself carried features that told their story without words. Sunken jaws, uneven eyes, twisted spines. The townspeople would catch glimpses of them when they wandered too close to the edge of the woods, ghost-like figures with faces that made strangers look away. People spoke of them in hushed tones, calling them cursed, touched, or not right, but rarely did anyone dare to ask why. To question too deeply was to invite the truth, and the truth was unbearable. The patriarch defended his reign with iron discipline. Punishment came swiftly to any child who disobeyed. It wasn't enough to control their bodies. He controlled their minds, convincing them that what was happening was not wrong, but destiny. He cloaked his violence in the language of family loyalty, twisting the sacred into something profane. To be his blood was to be his possession. To resist him was unthinkable. He was not just father, he was law, judge, and executioner inside those rotting walls. The daughter who became his wife grew old before her time. Neighbors said her eyes carried a hollow stare, the look of someone who lived not in years, but in survival. She bore child after child, some living, some not, her body weakening under the strain of a life no woman should endure. Yet she never left. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps the forest itself became her prison, the long dirt roads her chains. Escape, in her mind, may have been more terrifying than submission. Still, even the most carefully built cages crack. By the second generation, the deformities grew more severe, the whispers harder to ignore. A boy born with legs that could not straighten, a girl whose tongue was too thick for speech, children whose minds never fully formed, who wandered barefoot through the valley with vacant stares. They were living evidence of what had been done in that house, each one a breathing reminder that the line between father and husband had been obliterated. And yet, even then, the world turned away. The Appalachian mountains were littered with stories of poverty and hardship. Outsiders told themselves it was none of their concern. Officials, when they passed through, looked the other way. The horror was not hidden, it was simply ignored, and in that silence, his dynasty thrived, tightening its grip with each generation born into its curse. It is easy to imagine monsters as strangers, lurking in the shadows, faceless and distant, but the real monsters are often those who share our blood, and in his case that truth was undeniable. To outsiders, he was a patriarch holding together a struggling family in the backwoods. To those trapped under his roof, he was the architect of a nightmare that could never be spoken aloud. What made him so dangerous was not just what he did, it was how he justified it. He wrapped his sin in the language of heritage, of keeping the bloodline strong, of protecting family from outsiders who would never understand them. He convinced his children that they were chosen, set apart, even superior. And though the world saw deformity, he preached destiny. Though the world saw shame, he preached pride. His voice twisted reality until truth and lies blurred into a single, suffocating silence. The daughter who became his wife, her name never made it into official records, was erased even while she still lived. She became an object, a vessel, known only by her relation to him. Her identity was consumed by his will, her story swallowed whole by his dominance. Neighbors remembered her face but rarely her words. She had learned not to speak, not to reveal what was happening behind those walls. Perhaps she hoped silence might shield her children. Perhaps she knew it never could. By the third generation, the damage could no longer be hidden. The children's bodies bore too many signs, their minds too fractured. They wandered through the hills like forgotten souls, unintelligible in speech, unpredictable in behavior. When outsiders crossed paths with them, they often recoiled, whispering prayers under their breath. These children were not merely evidence of inbreeding. They were living monuments to a crime that had been allowed to continue unchecked for decades. Yet even then, no one intervened. Poverty was the perfect disguise. In a world where hunger and hardship were common, it was easy to dismiss this family's suffering as just another symptom of rural life. But make no mistake, this was not poverty alone. This was deliberate, orchestrated abuse sustained through fear and silence. He did not stumble into this horror. He built it, brick by brick, generation by generation, until the very concept of family was poisoned beyond recognition. The soil of Appalachia still remembers. The abandoned cabins, the broken headstones, the whispered stories passed down by those who swore they would never set foot near that family's land again. His legacy was not love, it was ruin. By the time word of the family began to spread beyond the valley, it was already too late. The damage had been done, etched into every child who bore his blood. Journalists, researchers, and curious strangers who stumbled upon them described the scene with a mix of pity and horror. What they found was not just poverty, not just hardship, but a living archive of inbreeding carried out in plain sight, hidden only by the silence of those who had chosen to look away. The children of the second and third generations could not hide their lineage. Their faces, their voices, even the way they moved, all told the truth of their origins. Some struggled to form words, their speech broken and slurred. Others walked hunched or sideways, their bodies twisting under the weight of too many generations of blood collapsed upon itself. And yet, when asked, they defended their life, defended their father, defended the rules that had made them what they were. That is the cruelest trick of all, when control seeps so deeply into the soul that the victim no longer knows they are enslaved. But outsiders could not look at them without recoiling. These children became legends, myths whispered in roadside diners and gas stations, stories told to frighten the curious away from the mountains. "Don't go up that hollow," they'd say. "You'll see things you can't forget." And they were right. One look into those faces, one moment of hearing those voices, and you understood. You were standing in the aftermath of something unspeakable. Yet, even as they became the subject of rumors and morbid fascination, their suffering remained real. They were not monsters. They were victims. Victims of a man who corrupted the role of father until it became something unrecognizable. Victims of a community that chose silence over action. Victims of a society that wrote them off as backwoods oddities instead of confronted. And the horror festering within its own borders. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like the neighbors did? Or would you have risked everything to break the cycle? Because cycles like this do not end on their own. They deepen, tighten, until someone finds the strength to sever them. And in this case, that strength never came. The patriarch's grip was too strong, his shadow too long, and his children paid the price with every breath they took. The weight of his choices did not vanish when his body was laid in the ground. Death does not erase legacy, it amplifies it. And for this family, his death was not a release, but a continuation. The habits he carved into their minds, the bloodlines he tangled beyond repair, carried on long after he was gone. The patriarch may have drawn his last breath, but his curse lived on in the children and grandchildren who could never escape what he had done. Researchers who studied families like his often noted the way trauma echoes through generations. It does not stop with the first victim. It is handed down invisibly, like an inheritance of sorrow. Children born into violence learn its language before they can speak. They grow in its shadow, shaped by it, until they either repeat it or collapse beneath it. And in his family the echo was deafening. Sons who never learned what fatherhood should mean. Daughters who believed obedience was survival. A lineage of brokenness, taught to see their suffering not as cruelty, but as destiny. Even when outsiders eventually tried to intervene, through social workers, through authorities, the damage was already too deep. How do you tell a child that the world they've known since birth was a prison? How do you explain that love should not wound, that family should not devour its own? For many of them, there was no understanding, no grasp of how different their lives should have been. They looked at the world through a lens warped beyond recognition. To them, the horror was normal. The story of America's most inbred patriarch is not confined to dusty records or forgotten valleys. It lingers in our understanding of how silence enables evil. Communities often tell themselves that certain horrors could never happen here, not in their town, not in their country. But the truth is more unsettling. They already have. They happened in the woods of Appalachia, behind doors that no one opened, in families that seemed too strange, too poor, too far away to matter. And by turning away, by dismissing the signs, the world gave this man everything he needed to carry out his dynasty of ruin. He believed his bloodline was his kingdom, and in a sense, he was right. For generations, his shadow ruled them. And even now, in the remnants of that family, his grip is still felt, because what he left behind was not just children. It was a legacy of silence, a reminder that the past is never really gone. Some stories are told to inspire, to uplift, to remind us of resilience in the face of hardship. This is not one of those stories. This is the story of how love can be corrupted, how family can be weaponized, and how silence can allow horror to grow unchecked. It is the story of a man who blurred every boundary until blood itself became his prison, and of a family that bore the weight of his obsession for generations. There are those who say the past should be left buried, that digging into these forgotten histories only opens wounds better left closed. But to ignore them is to risk repeating them. Because what happened in that cabin in Appalachia was not just the madness of one man, it was the failure of an entire community, a culture that chose to look away. Poverty was the excuse. Isolation was the shield. Fear was the chain. Together, they allowed his reign to continue until it reshaped the very faces of his children. The photographs that survive, the stories passed down in fragments, the half-legible records in county archives, they all point to the same truth. What he created was not a family. It was a dynasty of ruin, born out of control and silence. And though he has long since turned to dust, the echoes of his crime remain etched into American soil, a scar that cannot heal because it was never properly acknowledged. When you look into the hollow eyes of his descendants, you see more than deformity. You see history itself, twisted and broken, pleading not to be forgotten. You see what happens when the sacred trust between parent and child is shattered beyond recognition. You see the cost of silence, of complicity, of pretending that certain evils are too shameful to confront. And so we tell this story not to sensationalize, but to remember, because the past has eyes. It watches, it waits. And if we refuse to look back, if we refuse to confront the truths we wish to bury, then the darkness will always find its way forward. This was the story of America's most inbred patriarch, a man who took his own daughter as wife, a man whose name may be fading, but whose shadow will never disappear. Some legacies are built on love. His was built on silence, shame, and ruin, and the soil remembers, always.